Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology. Hello and welcome to Noble Mind. In this episode, we talk to Rich Goerling about his work bringing skills of mindfulness and compassion to police, military, and other first responders. He shares his understanding of the healthy and harmful aspects of police culture, how these relate to the experience of trauma, and the ideal of warrior humanitarianism.
Rich Goerling is a researcher and certified mindfulness trainer, a retired police officer, and a military veteran. He's the founder of Mindful Badge, an organization which delivers evidence-based skills training to support the health, humanity, and performance of first responders. You can learn more about his work, get this episode's show notes, and join our email list, all by visiting noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. So we are here with Rich Goerling. Welcome to Noble Mind. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Maybe we could just get ourselves started by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background so our listeners have a sense of who we're talking to today.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you. So I'm a retired police officer. I spent 24 years in policing in Oregon. I'm also a military veteran. I have another 27 years in the U.S. Coast Guard Reserve. Most of those was part-time. 6 of those years were active duty, particularly after 9/11. And what I do now is I'm a researcher, and I'm a certified mindfulness trainer, and I work with police organizations primarily. I work with other populations, but primarily police organizations at the local, state, tribal, and federal levels to train well-being through training mindfulness skills.
Wonderful. And we know that you have created an organization called Mindful Badge to sort of share mindfulness with the police and military, as you said. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your inspiration for starting that organization, what need you saw in the world, what was missing, and let us in on that a little.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I spent a couple of years on active duty after 9/11, and I had the opportunity to work with law enforcement organizations at all levels pretty closely, and both in the, what I like to say, in the boardrooms and on the boat decks. And it was just a really great perspective on what was happening in law enforcement with respect to occupational trauma, with respect to culture. So I came back from that 2 years. I was a police sergeant, and I just had a little different perspective about things. And I started really questioning some of the police culture bravado and some of the ways that we coped with occupational trauma that did not serve the officer well, did not serve the community well, created organizational incivility or toxicity. And I started exploring skills training that would make a difference. And I became a student of occupational trauma. I became a student of human performance, a student of humanity. And I continue that journey as a student, as a lifelong learner. And I created Mindful Badge after I discovered mindfulness. And there was just a fantastic human being, a guy named Brant Rogers, who's a certified MBSR teacher here in Hillsboro, Oregon, where I'm at. And I initially went to Brant to look for yoga because I knew that yoga was an important part of helping people find a connection to their body. And we did some of that, but then he introduced me to mindfulness, and I hated it, by the way. And I just kept with it. I thought, okay, this is uncomfortable. I don't like this, yet there's something here. And so I kept exploring. Brant and I built a relationship with Pacific University, which is a private university here in Oregon, specifically with their graduate school of psychology and Professor Mike Christopher. And we did some work in Hillsboro, Oregon with police officers in, I want to say like 2012-ish, 12, 13. And from that work, I realized that I needed to build Mindful Badge and sort of create a side hustle while I was still in policing. And frankly, that side hustle grew to a point where I had to leave. And so as soon as I could, actually, I retired early and have been dedicating, my full-time work to training mindfulness. And, It's always been in the spirit of the forward evolution of policing, or said differently, in the spirit of police reform. I mean, it was very evident to me that the system, criminal justice system, had a lot of problems, racism being one of them, a toxic culture being another. And there's a number of leadership failures within that system too, because we tend to want to lead the status quo. That's how you're successful. When you're in a system, you lead the status quo. That's how you're successful. Unless you're running some kind of innovative private sector company. And even then, a lot of private sector companies, you get big enough, you don't want to color outside the lines. And so I specialized in coloring outside the lines as a police lieutenant, and it was a problem. The system didn't like it. I made a lot of enemies, but I think you measure your courage and success in some ways, sometimes by the friends and enemies you make. And if you don't make people who don't like you, then maybe you're not pushing hard enough. So that's kind of a little bit of the origin story, a little bit of the motivation of where we're at today.
Would you like to say more about the police culture, occupational trauma? Does it intersect with the traditional male role model?
Well, there's no question that police culture is hypermasculine. And I think it's a maladaptive coping strategy to navigate occupational trauma. And there's this bravado and there's also this coping strategy of othering. And I think a lot of people on the outside of law enforcement see that as sort of malicious. And it's not. It's survival. Police officers are exposed to daily human trauma, daily human suffering, and sometimes it's very acute, and other times it's chronic, right? It's sort of low grade and occasional crisis. In order to cope with that, you learn to dehumanize other people so that you don't lose your capacity for being human. Although what we know is happening is that compassion skills are eroding, and oftentimes you move into a state of empathic distress fatigue, another trauma injury. And so that compounds and you turn into often, you buy into this cynical approach to the world around you, even when you don't want to. It's a pretty common way of being. And so just our strategies around how to hold humanity are not informed by science. And that was the thing for me, was like, we know about compassion. We can unpack compassion, and we can see compassion as a skill, or really, frankly, as a composite set of skills. And we can train those set of skills to maintain compassion, which holds boundaries, right? When we train, we talk about compassion being fierce and kind and holding boundaries. And empathy, on the other hand, is much harder. So, really limiting your movement into empathy with others when you're on the job is critically important, because you don't have that much energy to move into states of empathy with people on that kind of frequency. It'll burn you out, right? And so you get into states of distress, and that causes all kinds of problems. But, I think that we're seeing today a very understandable separation between police and the community. And it's in large part because of the vilification of police officers by people who want to see change. And that is also understandable too. And yet the rallying the wagons and the thin blue line and just holding people at arm's length and the vilifying police officers are both really poor strategies for forward momentum. And I think so both, and it's not as simple as left and right politics, yet it seems to be sometimes. But, so both the left and the right have to kind of figure some things out and bring some common principles of humanity and problem solving to the table. And right now, I think we're unable to do that. I mean, like I can tell you right now in Portland, Oregon, they're just at an impasse. Like I think you have willing police leaders and willing city leaders, but there's just so much history and trauma there that they just can't get anything done that's useful.
I mean, you're bridging a cultural gap, perhaps, between maybe like the mindfulness perspective and another perspective, or maybe policing perspective. And I've seen you're right about the warrior humanitarian ethos, the hero's journey, growth mindset, which would be inspiring for people who may look askance at mindfulness and compassion.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's a long history of warrior humanitarianism in the human experience, and then there's a long history of barbarism too, right? So, I mean, let's not just make everything seem really happy. But there is a consistent, or maybe it's not consistent, but there is a thread in the narrative of history of the human experience where people have come together and they've lived together and they've held a protective or guardian or warrior component to their society that offers protection to the world as we know it or they knew it. And yet often when we see that humanitarian component really deeply woven into the thread of that warrior ethos, we also see a real strong breadth of training, much far beyond the tactical and operational stuff. So, where they're poets and gardeners and teachers and writers and acrobats. And I mean, there's all kinds of interesting things, right? And so I think that part of our concern today is that policing is so linear in how we think, and our exposure to things is we only go outside the lines, to satisfy stakeholders for a brief period. And, so yeah, there's a number of things that are going on there, but the ethos of warrior humanitarianism is something that I think we as a society need to support, and that we all need to figure out what does that look like and how do we train that. And I think really it's guided by the Constitution of the United States of America. I mean, that's really it, right? And it's guided by what the current conversations and expectations of the American public are around policing, around safety, around public safety. And I think we really need to reinvent that. And that's complex. And I don't have any simple prescription, but here's what I know. What I know is that the men and women in law enforcement are not adequately resourced with skills of self-awareness, of self-regulation, of self-compassion, and of compassion and awareness for others and their environment. And we can train mindfulness to do the inner work of healing from trauma and setting conditions for post-traumatic growth, and also the inner work of reform, the inner work of the forward evolution of the profession of policing, really the inner work of the forward evolution of democracy in this country and what policing looks like.
I love your idea of that we're talking about around warrior humanitarians. And I'm wondering if you have any favorite examples, either from history or present time or literature or from anywhere, that might help our listeners sort of put a finer point on what that could look like or what that feels like.
Yeah. The American public misunderstands a lot about the modern military. But here's what I'll tell you, is that I've had the privilege of being closely connected with a small component of elite military operators. And, for example, my brother was a combat controller in the U.S. Air Force. And when I was, in my teenage years, he demonstrated to me what being a compassionate badass was all about. And he hung out with his team of a bunch of young guys who were highly trained and also just really decent human beings, right? And their conversations were kind, right? And they weren't nice, but they were kind. And they didn't walk around holding judgments against people. They walked around paying attention, right? And seeing the world as broadly as they could. They walked around open with a curiosity about what was going on around them instead of a sense that they already knew everything. And that was a powerful experience for me. And so, I subsequently have had some personal interactions with some of those guys. My brother lost his life in that role. But, I think that the modern military, there's components, there's pockets of modern military, whether it's in the special operations community or other components of the military, where men and women who are highly trained have figured out that there's a level of equanimity that comes with that role and that responsibility. And they figured out how to cultivate that, how to practice that, and how to bring that with their role. And that's, I think, if we pay attention, we can see that. There's also, but the American public doesn't see that. They see a lot of the superficial stuff and they see the movies. But I think there is even today existing a deeper level of warriorship that is deeply rooted in humanity that's available for us today. I also think too that, we look back at, we often refer to like the samurai traditions. I think there's some First Nations traditions of warrior humanitarianism too that we need to look at. And in fact, I'm in some conversation with my colleague, Jeff Prue at Brown University, about this very topic. We're exploring like, hey, what do we know about the history of Native peoples and their warrior humanitarian traditions that we can learn from? Of course, we can go back to the Greeks. We can look at Asian cultures. We could look at Bruce Lee, right? Seriously, like the philosopher, artist, teacher, warrior there, and just the wisdom that he can bring. So there's no end to the exploration of where humanity exists in warriorship, or as I like to refer to it sometimes, in badassery, right? And, all of us have some element of showing up in the world under difficult circumstances and persevering and being skillful. And whether it's parenting or, teaching, or whatever vocation, there's an element of this grit, this element of this resilience, this element of this humanity and compassion and strength that shows up for everybody. And so the unfortunate part is, I think that police culture for a while co-opted this warrior term, and now it's become, we have to really reinvent the word in police culture, and we have to, because what's happening is it's being dismissed as not even an option. We can't use that term anymore. We have to make up a new term, and we did that for years. We started using terms like guardian and protector. The problem is we didn't change the culture; we just changed the word, and we need to shift the culture. And once we shift the culture, it doesn't matter what word we use. We're teaching those skills of humanity that allow men and women in policing to show up day after day after day and bear witness to human suffering and take action to intervene. Oftentimes that action is incomplete. Oftentimes that action isn't good enough, but it's all they can do because that's how the systems are set up. And, and I think too, it's worthy of calling out that there's a lot of fair criticism to policing in America right now. And there's a lot of really interesting conversations that fail to hold accountability in other parts of our society. So for example, we talk a lot about police officers dealing with the mentally ill, with, crises, mental illness, and, people who are unhomed and suffering from substance use disorders and all these things. Absolutely. That's a very real issue. And as a society, we've all said apparently that it's, well, okay, we're not going to invest upstream in all those issues. Let's let the cops deal with it later. And then when the cops don't deal with it right, because you can't, even social workers out in the field are not going to solve this problem. We're triaging, right? We're in extremis on a social issue that's just so broken. So we want to hold the coppers accountable for the crisis, and yet we don't want to invest in children and education and mental health and integrated medicine and economic opportunities and, all these other things that are systemic. And to me, it's just like, really, you don't want police reform. You just want to be performative, get back in your Tesla and drive away. And I just call a little bit of bullshit about some of the wealthy middle class folks who are on this bandwagon. Now, for my friends who are people of color, that's a different conversation. For them, it's like, hey, this has been oppressive for 400 years. Can we fix this? And the answer is yes. And yes, we should. So we have a complex set of problems that we're facing. But I think, for folks who are listening to this podcast, what's our response as if we could say that we're in this sort of community of mindfulness practitioners, which is diverse, sort of. What is our response to these issues in police reform? And how can we increase our understanding, increase our dialogue, and understand that some of the issues in reform are well beyond the boundaries of the American police institution?
So when social problems get neglected, then it ends up being the police who are showing up in these situations and having to be the ones to step in the crisis.
Right. Yeah. So here's an example. I'm doing some work with Center for Counsel, a social justice nonprofit in Los Angeles. And Jared Seid, the executive director, and I designed a 6-month training program for LAPD officers, and actually it's for any police organization. And so we're training this remarkable group of people in LAPD, and they work for what's called the Community Safety Partnership Bureau. It's a bureau of probably 150 LAPD officers. And these officers go to the most violent parts of the city, communities in the city, and they build relationships. And the goal is to intervene, right? And so they're investing a lot of time with youth, building relationships with youth. And their goal is not to enforce any law that they identify as being broken, right? Their goal is prevention. And one of the things I learned training with them recently is that in Watts, this community in South Central, 2% of the kids who graduate from high school go to college. And what I would say to people who, want to reform policing, I say, yes. And what are we doing about the 98% of those kids who are graduating from high school in Watts who don't go to college? Now, I'm not suggesting every kid needs to go to college, but there's a gross failure to invest in our young people in America today. And I mean, you could do the math, you could do the social math and figure out that that's going to be problematic because these kids are probably not going to work productively, right? And so there's a host of problems with that. But here's the amazing thing. So the same police officers that are getting vilified, those same cops are building nonprofit foundations that take kids who graduate from Los Angeles and get them to college. In fact, there's a Watts to Boston nonprofit started by a LAPD officer who takes these kids, and now it's beyond Watts, but these kids who they mentor them, through their youth, to get them to graduate high school, and they get them scholarships. At first it was Boston College, and now it's a number of different colleges. And so isn't that remarkable, right? And so these are the cops and their networks building these nonprofits to be able to do something to make a difference. And these people are not bastards, right? I mean, it's just such an interesting conflagration of suffering on both sides of the badge that somehow we have to figure out how to navigate through. And, and I think that mindfulness, I think that training awareness and training compassion is a path forward, to help each of us navigate our own biases that emerge, right? I have been an advocate of police reform and an advocate of acknowledging and addressing racism in policing for a very long time as a contrarian inside the system. And that's not a fun place to be most of the time. And yet I struggle with some of the messaging and some of the tactics that are being employed to create change. Well, they're not even to create change. I mean, in Portland, Oregon, it's a mess, right? It's like violence towards police is not helpful. And yet that's kind of what's frequently happening. I would routinely have friends of mine who worked with Portland Police Bureau call me up and say, "Hey, dude, we know we need change. We're ready. We're ready to have this dialogue, to move forward. And all we're doing is working 16 hours, standing in the line." This is in the heat, post George Floyd. And some of that, I don't know, maybe some of that's necessary initially, but as we navigate forward, we have to train skills in humanity with police officers, and we have to treat them as humans, and because they are. And conversely, police officers have to meet their community members even when they make them uncomfortable, and again, it's just about cultivating this ethos of equanimity. Really, we don't have to call it warrior humanitarianism. It's this ethos of equanimity where we can be curious, we can be open, we can work with the judgments that we all have so that we can collaborate and lead together and create change.
You're offering a wonderfully wide and long-term view of the picture, and you're advocating a more upstream and a whole system change rather than get a few people to be nicer. And in your work, there are some intriguing things on your website about the trainings you offer, also around resilience. I wonder if you can tell us how you connect those.
one of the things that I have learned is that it's important to cultivate resilience, and resilience and humanity go hand in hand, right? So to cultivate, I don't know, what we might call grit, right? To cultivate the ability to be in distress and to still act with skillful action, right? And so I started doing a lot of trainings that are resilience-based trainings. But so what we developed was something called mindfulness-based resilience training. And it was a derivation of John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction. And it's really sort of what's become the primary research model in training, and it's very helpful. So we're training police officers. We don't start the conversation on day one as, hey, we're here to engage in police reform. That's not how we do it. We start the conversation by, hey, we're here to train in this really kind of interesting thing called mindfulness, and you're not going to like it. Here's some science why we're doing it. Maybe we share some of the outcomes we've had in research. Maybe we don't. And here's what it entails. And here's what we know about the landscape of suffering within the occupation of policing. So we have some data, right? And police officer suicide and all kinds of other data about how, I guess we'd say, how low of a score we'd have on the metrics of health and well-being in policing. And then we train mindfulness. And over time, which, ideally over a number of weeks, we move from training mindfulness skills in three domains. We work with the thinking mind. So we work with thoughts, right? Of course. Yeah. And we work with emotion. And we bring some science around emotion we just love. We're huge fans of Lisa Feldman Barrett and her work out of Northeastern University and the constructed theory of emotion. It's a different take on emotion, and I think it's just operationally and culturally very relevant. And really, we teach cops that emotions are not controllable. We can learn to regulate emotion, but you can't turn them off and on. And so we spend a lot of energy trying to control emotion, which is either in the moment, not experiencing it, or bottling it up over time. And that creates a whole host of problems. And then the other domain we train is in the body, right? And of course, all those domains are the same domain, but we kind of separate them for training purposes. And then we teach compassion. And it's a light version maybe of mindful self-compassion, but it doesn't have to be all that significant. And frankly, any meditation practice is an act of self-compassion. Anytime you sit in stillness and observe yourself, that's an act of compassion, right? So just that alone is an act of compassion. And what we find is that the dialogue that emerges in this training, because we talk about things like curiosity and acceptance and non-judgment and compassion, is a really fascinating learning dialogue that opens up officers to seeing the world slightly differently. And it's that classic, it's training for vertical development. Like in the coaching world, we refer to this as vertical development, right? So we want to grow our perspective of the world around us, of our relationship to the world around us. We want to grow it. We want to open that horizon of how we see the world. It's vertical development, right? I'm growing, as opposed to training to get skills that just support where I'm at right now, to support my perspective on policing or to support my perspective on politics or whatever it is. Mindfulness is a very gentle and effective way of challenging a person's relationship to everything around them. And we don't prescribe it. I don't tell people what they should believe, because I don't even think, I don't know what they should believe, right? But I trust that when we're teaching attention and compassion, I trust that, the universe is going to do some good things with that. And it generally does. Now, there's always the risk of humanity not really taking, because you can train in attention skills and get more skillful at causing harm. Sure. I haven't seen that yet. I haven't seen that emerge. I don't know. It's possible. But I think the risk there is pretty minimal. So we're teaching resilience. We're teaching how to show up in the world more skillfully, with greater awareness of self, greater regulation of self. And just that awareness and regulation of self has some really great health benefits. And so our research at Pacific University, we're seeing results like, reductions in self-reported, this is nearly all self-reported, perceptions of operational stress and administrative stress. We're seeing greater emotion regulation, greater compassion, greater empathy, greater pain management, sleep. We are seeing a biometric. We're seeing greater cortisol regulation among police officers. And in our partner up at University of Wisconsin, they've found reductions in symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder among police officers. So there's some really good data.
I'm curious because you said when you started to practice mindfulness, you hated it, and yet you kept at it. And then you also mentioned when you have started to teach this to people, often they hate it. I'd love to hear do you think it is that inspires hate initially? And then maybe, how'd you keep at it? Or how do you inspire people to keep at it?
Well, I think that hate is a strong term.
Yeah.
There's a natural aversion. And so I think it's driven by two primary things. One is the personality that comes to law enforcement is an action personality. Some might say it's tendencies towards ADHD, right? So we don't want to be still. We want to move. It's one of the reasons we love the job. It's like you go to this thing, you work it, and you go to another thing and you do it, right? There's no sitting in a cubicle and holding still. And we don't like to do that. The other component is, so maybe there's some personality there, I don't know, is trauma. Because how we learn to cope with trauma, I think this is just humans naturally, in the absence of other skills, training, or other, genetic traits that we've inherited that are useful, we move. We don't want to pay attention. We want to be distracted. We want to, even to a point of dissociate with this thing called the body, this remarkable human machine that we inhabit. And so I think what we're asking people who are trauma professionals, we're asking them to sit still and observe. One, it's not what we do. And two, it's uncomfortable because we notice things that we don't like, or we notice things that are distressing. And that can be a problem, right? So there's some trauma-informed skills that, we need to have when we're training that. But how do we keep people to stay in that? Well, humans generally are pretty resilient. They're pretty adaptable, right? And they're pretty badass, really. Police officers, other first responders, military members, they often respond well to a challenge. And so really we offer mindfulness as a challenge. Sit with us. Notice what's there. That's all you need to do. It may be uncomfortable, and you're good at being uncomfortable. So be uncomfortable with us together. And it's kind of all it takes. Like, okay, all right. This is why we let them know, like this is not relaxation training, right? And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of mindfulness light out there that wants to make people feel happy. I could give a shit if you feel happy. That is not my goal. My goal is to train you to be an effective police officer, which means you hold humanity, right? Which means that you're capable of stepping into a crisis and performing your trade craft skillfully and holding humanity and treating people with compassion, treating people with dignity, and doing the work that the community expects you to do. I want you to be healthy. I want you to experience joy and adventure and all these other really great things. But that's not our goal. Our goal is not to do that. Our goal is to train for performance. And so I frame mindfulness as we're really training to health. And health gets us to be able to train to humanity, and health and humanity allows us to train for performance. We want to optimize our capacity to perform in the scope of our duties as police officers or whatever population we're training. We'll train retirees, we'll train people affiliated. I've trained mental health clinicians who work with cops, social workers who work with cops in the same space with police officers, chaplains, other program managers, people who are really just trying to understand. And I have actually trained a couple of politicians who I've first built trusted relationships with and then brought them into the right place in the right time. So,
well, it sounds like a lot of what you're describing is so intimately connected to leadership broadly, self-leadership, leadership in the community, and the healthy and constructive use of power. So I would imagine anybody who has power to wield in the world, which is basically anyone, might benefit from the cultivation of these skills.
Yeah, Kate, that's a really great point. I love how you frame that. Absolutely. I will tell police officers that every mindfulness training is a leadership training. And what we're learning is how to lead ourselves. because if we can't lead ourselves, we can't lead effectively other people.
And I think there's also there's a sort of a polarity that's developed in some way where I think in the mindfulness and compassion realm, there's a tendency towards, I don't know, just kind of maybe not owning your power, or maybe feeling uncomfortable with having power or being a leader, whether it's yourself or in the world. Or it feels like, what you're trying to do and offer is to sort of build a bridge in some way between these two polarities of, either kind of more inner focused, reflective without action, or more outer focused, action oriented people to be more interior, to cultivate more of that inner life.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. And, I have bumped up against this tendency in the mindfulness communities that I'm privileged to be a part of. I think there is a tendency in some people to want to kind of have a low impact influence on others because maybe they feel that, I don't know, it's too dominant, or I don't know, too aggressive or whatever. And I understand that. And I also know that that's not me. And I know that, if we want to create change, it requires showing up in a way that is vulnerable. And that vulnerability is asking for something, right? Because every time I show up to train a group of police officers, I'm asking for something. I'm asking for a number of somethings. First thing I'm asking for is, hey, come to this space and train. And then I'm asking, sit in a circle, which is weird, right? Because cops don't ever do that. And agree to participate with some rules, right? Which means that you're not going to behave like you probably would if you're at a regular training and we're sitting in this sort of didactic, power structure of teacher or student. We create a little different power dynamic. So I'm asking them to participate in that. I'm asking them to participate in sitting in stillness and paying attention to themselves, right? And so all of that, I mean, and there's so many other things. It's a big deal, right? Now, I could just practice mindfulness in my home and occasionally have conversations over the coffee with police officers and hope that one day that they all kind of learn how to do mindfulness, right? But I've chosen to be in this space, and that comes with risks and it comes with failure. So here's the other side of that. There have been times, and probably will be times in the future, when I, in the effort to create change, offend people. In the effort to create change, misspeak or don't listen well enough, or, take actions that are counterproductive, right? And one would argue that if I wasn't so out there, those things wouldn't happen. And if I were slower and more contemplative, those things wouldn't happen. Yeah, probably. And there's just too much at stake to go slow.
I was going to say those things wouldn't happen, but neither would anything else.
Yeah. I had a mentor years ago, who said to me, Rich, what do you want to do? Because it was a time I was looking at, I wanted to become a mindfulness teacher, and he was talking to me about pathways. And he said, so Rich, you need to make a choice. Do you want to change the world, or do you want to become a mindfulness teacher? And I looked at him and said, I want to do both. And, so I don't know, I'm sure not everyone resonates with that statement, but like, no, we need to create change. And even so, like, the progress we've made isn't all that fantastic in the last decade. I mean, we've introduced it. Mindfulness is a regular part of the conversation now in police organizations that do training and such. But we haven't gotten to a place where senior police leadership, even senior criminal justice leadership, so for example, the U.S. Department of Justice, where people really understand what's happening here from an evidence-based perspective, not from a contemplative perspective, but an evidence-based perspective. Understand how mindfulness can be integrated into the solutions moving forward in police reform. I believe mindfulness skills training is the foundation for change. Because, for example, if we train a group of police officers in some mindfulness, in some self-awareness, some self-compassion, self-regulation, where we're cultivating skills like curiosity, right, and openness and non-judgment, we are setting the stage for the ability of those officers to sit in a room and listen and learn from a person of color who's teaching about anti-racism. And if we just put those cops in the room with that person, we will be less effective. We have to use mindfulness to mitigate occupational trauma, which is one of the major ingredients of why police culture is where it is today, right? We need to change our perspectives around occupational trauma. This is why growth mindset, Alex, you mentioned that earlier. That's why growth mindset is so critical. We've created so much drama around occupational trauma and policing that, it really has not served us well, and it exacerbates trauma, injury, and creates harm. And maybe it's important for your listeners to know this. What the data tell us about being a first responder, it's not just being a police officer, but first responder, is that these men and women will experience trauma injury multiple times over the course of their career. They will experience trauma injury. And that will look like a lot of small things and probably one or two or three or four big things. And we don't train a culture that understands that science, and we don't train a mindset that allows them to thrive through that reality. And mindfulness is at the core of how to be trauma competent. It's well beyond trauma informed. And it's critical to be trauma informed, but some of how we're operationalizing that is just nonsense. I train people to be trauma competent, which means it's kind of following Kelly McGonigal's approach to the upside of stress, right? It's that we can get good at stress. How we think about it is critically important. And what's interesting is that we're still stuck in a disorder mindset in police culture and maybe in society, right? Of, trauma, trauma happens to me and I don't want that. Okay. Trauma is something we experience as being human. It's not unique to 2021. It's not unique to COVID. I mean, people have been suffering since they've been dropped on this planet, right? Or whatever, however we got here. And people have been really good at it. And we have a long history of data and story, which is data, that tell us that people have been able to thrive through trauma. And it sucks, right? That's why we call it trauma. But they've been able to come through it with some greater wisdom than they had, before they started that experience. And I think training for that potential for post-traumatic growth is critical. Now, we have to be responsible because sometimes it's not going to happen. But to set the conditions for growth is critically important. And that starts long before we ever experience trauma injury. It starts with how we build culture around occupational trauma, human suffering, humanity, right? This is why it's so critically important. And I think we've just, begun to explore how humanity can be operationalized and trained to first responders. Mindfulness is a component. There's probably a lot of other approaches to this. Mindfulness allows us to settle into the reality of occupational stress and trauma and work with it skillfully. And from there, we have a base from which to be able to grow. And without that, we're stuck. Without that, we're trying to teach hurt people not to hurt people. And we're pretty sure that doesn't work.
I'm also struck as you're talking that beneath that sort of civilian, military, civilian, first responder, police, whatever that surface level divide is, that there's an underlying universality to trauma on all sides. And that's just everywhere. And then maybe what we're seeing showing up in the world are these different ways of coping with it, or beliefs about what it means in humanity writ large, or how we're supposed to respond.
Yeah, my studies of trauma and humanity have brought me to this obvious realization that we're all the same, right? There's no significant difference between how an emergency department staff, the nurses, the staff, the doctors navigate trauma than do police officers. And ultimately, my vision is just to train to take, teachers who are working, inner city schools and medical teams and police officers and firefighters and nonprofit, personnel, and training them all together. Right. I mean, that would be fantastic, right? Because what we can actually learn from each other, we can learn about our cultures and, use the emergency departments at trauma centers as a great example. there's a lot of similarities to how we cope with trauma because we're human and we see tragic outcomes of violence and mishaps, and that we have something in common there. But definitely a lot of commonality in trauma, and I think too that we, when I talk about the nonsense, I think that there's a lot of drama that we create, and like we even hear, and it may be appropriate in some circumstances, but it's not with the populations I work with. We hear a change in tone and inflection in the language we use when we start talking about trauma. We soften our voice, we lengthen our syllables. Like, come on. Why can't we just walk up and say, hey, trauma sucks. Let's talk about it, right? There's nothing special about it. Let's have some conversations about how we cope with it. Let's do it smartly. And, I don't feel sorry for you because you're trauma injured. I mean, don't we often do that to each other? Oh, hey, Alex, I'm so sorry you experienced this. More, just change the conversation. Now, it might not be appropriate in every context, but I'd be like, hey, Alex, dude, that sucks. Yeah, that's predictable, dude. Yeah. Thanks for your service. Thanks for going through this. How can I support you with the actions you need to take towards healing and recovery?
So not in hushed tones, but violins playing.
Yeah,
in the background.
yeah. Well, I think what it gets fragilized.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we fragilize our people around trauma, and that is not serving us well in the long run. And I think it exacerbates the trauma injury. I think it makes it worse. I do want to say this because I think this is important for your listeners. One of the observations that I've made, one of the conclusions that I've come to is that in policing, there are three dominant forces that create suffering. And when it comes to the actions of the officers or the actions of senior leaders. And that is when emotion and so emotions like anger and fear and ego, even though ego is not really an emotion, but those three things, fear, anger, and ego, are dysregulated. And when they dysregulate, we typically make cognitive decisions that do not serve us and do not serve our communities. Mindfulness training is a direct intervention to the dysregulated ego, fear, and anger. And, that's important. That's important because chronic occupational trauma and unmitigated trauma injury will lead to the dysregulation of emotion and ego predictably and consistently across every community. It's a human phenomenon. And we can use science, because we understand that from science and from wisdom of paying attention, to intervene. And we can begin to understand some of the videos that we're seeing out, that launch, right? Now, there are some cases, I think the George Floyd case, the homicide there was a clear case of just, we have a villain, right? And so there's a small percentage of villains in every profession. If we can set that aside and just look at the large body of men and women in law enforcement, the majority with the proper training, they have the will, they have the will and the willingness to grow and to perform consistent with how the Constitution has framed how we perform in a democracy, but also consistent with how the community wants us to perform in the 21st century. We just simply need to resource them with skills and not knowledge, because we can talk all day about these things and it doesn't do a damn bit of good until we teach skills.
But there's that wonderful quote on your website: knowledge is only rumor until it lives in the body.
Yeah. It's a quote from Richard Strozzi Heckler, somatic psychologist in Northern California. Yeah. And another guy who I've learned a lot of warrior wisdom from. So yeah, we have to integrate mindfulness into this remarkable human machine and how it shows up in the world. And we can do that. We've seen it done. We hear anecdotes from police officers on a regular basis of how mindfulness has changed something about how they're showing up. And these are powerful things.
I think your views deserve to be known by the general public, because they can really impact the various debates and understanding of what's actually going on. Because otherwise, without this kind of nuanced understanding, we're just chasing shadows, I think.
Yeah, Alex, that's a great term, chasing shadows, because that's really what it feels like. I met with a senior police leader last week, and, he's just so frustrated because they're like, man, we're in a space right now where nothing can happen. Like no forward momentum can happen, even though we have everybody on all sides of the issue, 360 degrees wants something to happen, but we're like vapor locked in conflict. It's disturbing where we're at. And yet, I think we'll get through it. I don't know what's going to shift, but I mean, I'm hopeful that we'll move through it, because I think we have a long history in this country of navigating conflict and issues, social issues. And if we just find our way through, I think really great things are going to happen, and it's just going to be really hard. There's no question. I think there's an opportunity here for the mindfulness teaching community to do our own work first about our own aversion to this population, because that's real. That's real. And to find a way, if there's a calling to that direction, find a way to work with this population. And my team of trainers, we've designed a training for mindfulness teachers to help them be culturally competent and trauma competent to work with policing and really with mindfulness, the focus really being as a change, right? Is leading change. And not every mindfulness teacher wants to do that, but those that do can certainly reach out to me, and we can talk about ways to cultivate those skills, because it's not something that they're equipped to do with their standard kind of work, that, standard paths of training mindfulness. Some very unique things about this population that are helpful to understand.
And you're saying cultural competence isn't just about police officers being culturally competent about communities they serve, but also about people who outside the police culture, and to understand really what they're going through instead of prescribing things to them. Yeah,
absolutely. Like humanity is multidirectional, right? And we're talking about two populations. We could say it's bidirectional, which means that if I'm a police officer, I need to strive to understand the community that I serve, right? And that means there's a learning journey for me always, right? Mm-hmm. I don't just learn once and I'm good. I'm always learning. I'm always curious, right? I'm always taking in information and adjusting what I'm learning to integrating what I'm learning, let's just say, right? The skills embodied. And similarly, if we're going to train a population of people, understanding those folks, right? And so it's like the police ought to understand their communities, and the communities ought to understand their police. And these are principles actually that are 100 years old, that were talked about when the UK built policing. And, Sir Robert Peel had all these principles of policing that, allegedly I was supposed to learn at some point, but never really did. This is a community effort. And I do think there's going to be some major shifts to how chiefs and, let's say police chiefs, because they're not elected, how police chiefs lead going forward, and engaging community leaders strategically in the conversations like they've never done before. Having advisory boards of trusted, kind of the classic old kitchen cabinet, right? Of senior leaders throughout your community, coming from a diverse, places that you build relationships with, that you have agreements with, that you can talk through really hard issues of how do we show up in our community, because public safety is a community collaborative effort. And so a lot of things need to shift. And my focus is really on the organic technology. It's teaching the skills to the officers and police leaders so that we can be part of the effort, that we can lead from within. We lead from within ourselves, and we lead from within the institution of policing. And then we meet somewhere out in our communities with people who are leading on the outside, and then we find a way to lead together.
Sounds wonderful.
So if people want to learn more about you, your work, Mindful Badge, where should they go and what should they do?
My website is mindfulbadge.com, and they can email me at richard@mindfulbadge.com.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for your time. This is a really stimulating conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate your time too.
Very good to meet you. Thank you for your work as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.